guys. So the debates were weird, right? Trump seemed to ramble on, and Hillary seemed overly coached and so smug, and to me, she seemed generally unwell and unhealthy. So after I was done watching, I had a really hard time deciding who was the winner per se, since it seemed to be a very poor showing from the both of them. All Trump really needed to do was be restrained and not appear so scary, and I think in that he probably succeeded. I was very surprised to see that in nearly every post-debate poll, including those for all but one left-leaning outlet, Trump was overwhelmingly the debate victor. It should be noted that CNN polled more Democrats and ended up with vastly skewed results compared to all the other media outlets. But the Time poll, which I think now has around 2 million respondents, is at 55% for a Trump win. How is it possible that if these are true random sample respondents, that we are getting vastly different polling results between outlets? Opinion polls notoriously produce erroneous results for a litany of reasons. Question wording, question order, and the number and type of alternative answers available greatly influence poll results. So let's go through this Bloomberg National Politics poll from this time last year. These questions are egregiously slanted. I think the worst one is this one about Iran, which says, "The deal with Iran is done, so it is better to strongly enforce it to make it better than to rip it up." First of all, the survey taker is notified in the first part of that sentence that it is a done deal, making it clear that reforming it is not really an option. The only option outside of enforcement is to rip it up, just based on the wording of the question. Note also that the question says, quote, "It is better to strongly enforce it to make it better." If there is a problem with the Iran deal, how is strongly enforcing it going to do anything but amplify its existing problems? So a survey taker would think that enforcing the deal means improving it because of the coercive wording of the survey question, and would say probably that enforcement is a better alternative, of which only 2 were given anyway. A number of these questions are shocking in their bias, so I encourage you to read through the others if you have time, and I've linked that below. But survey wording is less of a problem in presidential election polling, since it really should just be a straightforward, who has your vote? But when they can't take advantage of one inherent bias, pollsters double down on those that they can't exploit. Coverage bias is when samples that are not representative of the population that a researcher is studying are used, and then they're extrapolated to the population in question. I encourage you to check out Bill Mitchell's work on this, which is also linked below. He's analyzed hundreds and hundreds of polls and compared the polling sample's political orientation breakdown with that of their respective state. So his findings were very consistent in that in all of the polls, more Democrats were surveyed. So even in a state like Georgia, which is predominantly Republican, more respondents were Democrats, and this was not adjusted for. I will admit that when I heard that these variables weren't corrected for, I did not believe it, because it seems like such a transparent polling bias, and it seems really brazen to me. But as it so happens, this is true. I went on the Pew Research website where they outline their polling methods, and I found this. While it would be easy to standardize the distribution of Democrats, Republicans, and independents across all of these surveys, this would unquestionably be the wrong thing to do. While all of our surveys are statistically adjusted to represent the proper proportion of Americans in different regions of the country, younger and older Americans, whites, African Americans, and Hispanics, and even the correct share of adults who rely on cell phones as opposed to landline phones, these are all known and relatively stable characteristics of the population that can be verified off of U.S. Census Bureau or other high-quality government data sources. Party identification is another thing entirely. Most fundamentally, it is an attitude, not a demographic. To put it simply, party identification is one of the aspects of public opinion that our surveys are trying to measure, not something that we know ahead of time, like the share of adults who are African American, female, or who live in the South. Particularly in an election cycle, the balance of party identification in surveys will ebb and flow with candidate fortunes, as it should, since the candidate themselves are the defining figureheads of those partisan labels. Thus, there is no timely, independent measure of the partisan balance that polls could use for a baseline adjustment. Basically, what this means is that while they control for a number of concrete and measurable characteristics, party identification is an attitude. Therefore, it cannot be accurately measured and used for a baseline adjustment. Yes, that means that to Pew Research, it is not essential to choose poll respondents with the same proportion of Republicans and Democrats and independents as the state or region that they're studying. And it is simply untrue that party ID is immeasurable and of little consequence. Gallup did a study where they just determined party ID, which is different than party registration. Registration leans towards Democrats, and if you ask the party ID of the same people, you would probably find that some affiliated with a different party and just hadn't changed their registration. So according to this Gallup study, the US is 29% Republican, 29% Democrat, and 42% independent. Why on earth would pollsters not conduct party ID surveys like this on their subject population and use the results for a baseline adjustment? Some of the other huge problems with polling are less technical and more intuitive. One serious issue is that people today are much more difficult to get a hold of. For decades, pollsters used landlines to contact people, but today only 40 per 100 people have landlines, although it amazes me that it's even that many, right? Additionally, FCC regulations make it much more difficult to survey people on their cell phones, and people now screen their calls. So researchers used to get around a 50% response rate, which is basically unheard of now, and today it's in the single digits. This might seem inconsequential if those respondents still represent the larger population, but what if those screening their calls and that do not have landlines share characteristics, like they're younger than the population that you're studying? Well, right there you've screwed your poll, and the results are unusable unless there's a very accurate baseline adjustment. But I think perhaps the most significant reason that polls are wildly inaccurate is simply because respondents lie. They often succumb to what is called social desirability bias, where they answer based on conforming to social norms rather than being truthful. A really good example of this is in trying to identify non-voters, which is extremely important. So when asked if they will vote, consistently, people are often either overly optimistic about what their motivation will be on election day, or they lie because they're too embarrassed to admit that they're shirking their civic duty. We saw huge social desirability bias in Brexit, where polls all but guaranteed the voters were firmly in the Remain camp, even like hours before the vote. I also believe that we're seeing this in the Trump campaign. When you are treated like this for being a Trump supporter, it is really easy to lie about it, even if you were just doing so on a survey. I think that this just might be our Brexit. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in a few days. Bye.